Okay. All right. Welcome to another edition of the weekly forecast contest or subseasonal forecast contest. We're back from our hiatus, 2-week hiatus. Today's forecast, mark date, January 7th. Again, we're forecasting for the 16 to 20, which is January 22nd to January 26th. For today, since we had a couple weeks off, and suggested by Zach, I think we're going to spend quite a bit of time on sort of attribution or kind of looking back and just kind of getting back in touch a little bit. And again, everyone should feel free to jump in and volunteer as we kind of look back at the last couple weeks and to see what's going on. And then we'll follow our usual process today, kind of going through the current forecast and giving the forecast contestants an opportunity to kind of give a 2-minute briefing to practice as if they're speaking to a client. And we may have some time at the end for Michael to go through his research. And I think that captures most everything. So so let's jump in here. I'm going to turn back to our most recent verification. I think that's from December. Actually, do we have one more? Yeah. So actually, we'll look at both weeks, right? Again, because we've been off. So I'll start the week before. This is from, and Zach, just jump in here if I'm off base here too. But this is from December 10th, and this is for the verification December 25th to 29th. So, and I'll sort this here by the forecast and then the verification. And clearly, I mean, just zooming out here for a second, right? And we joked about this before we started the recording, but clearly the pattern has gone bonkers warm, right? We'll look at numbers to define bonkers here in a minute, but I think in terms, since we're forecasting here HDDs, national HDDs, when you look at the end of December and the first half of January, I think what you'll see is this period is ranked very warm, very anomalously warm, one of the warmest. I don't think it's the warmest on record, but probably a top 5 or top 10. So that's interesting. And the other interesting aspect about it, I think, is the fact that the forecast, as we can see here, didn't fully capture this transition, right? They didn't fully capture the transition or the length of this warm period. So this forecast is a great example. So we had forecasts that ranged on the warm side from 125 HDDs, Paul Roundy, and to the cold side, 155 HDDs, one of our industry participants. And you can see the verification here. I had to check to make sure this was not an error, and I don't think it is, was 102.8 HDDs. So, clearly this pattern came in a lot warmer than anticipated. And before we kind of turn to the maps and such, I guess if you're like me, maybe the first thing you're thinking is, was that just an aberration? Maybe it's just a 1-week kind of thing. Well, we know it's not, because, we can look now. I just flipped forward to the most recent verification. This is for the period verifying January 1st to January 5th. So just a couple days ago. And again, I'll sort it now by the forecast means, or the forecast. And again, and this is also not a bug, the lowest forecast, Paul Roundy had the same forecast again, 125 HDDs. The coldest forecast, highest HDDs, almost 175 by the CFS, and the verification was 114. So the verification wasn't quite as much of an outlier as it was from the previous week, but clearly it was another forecast that verified, or period that verified, much warmer than any of the forecasts in our distribution. And, maybe the closest here being Professor Roundy and Professor Decker, who I think just jumped online, also had a pretty good forecast there. Mm-hmm. And you can see that by the scores. So, and I think when we look at what's coming up here the next 5 and 10 days, I think we're going to see something similar here. Of course, we don't have, I think this was the last forecast before the break. So we don't have a forecast for around Christmas, but just looking, I cheated, and I'll just show this here real quick. I know some of you folks probably don't look at this page, but this shows you the EC ensemble, and these are HDDs. So these numbers, I'll look at the 0Z run. This is most recent 0Z run from January 7th vertically. So 25.7, 29.5. These are HDD forecasts. And the color code tells you if they're warmer or colder than normal. So the yellows and reds suggest warmer than normal. And if you want, you can see the normals all the way here on the right column. So that's what the normal HDD should be for that day. And anyway, the long story short is at least for the next, I don't know, almost 10 days, the forecasts are still for HDDs to be well below normal, i.e. For temperatures to be well above normal. So this is a pretty warm pattern. And I'll just show one other thing here before I officially open it up. Let's just look at maybe some of these forecasts in terms of the maps. And just want to get back. Let's get back to that first week. So the first verification period was December 25th to the 29th. So I'm just going to pull that up here. This tool, and it should be available to everyone. This is the Dynacast tool from our friends at Maxar. It's a really cool tool. You can do a lot of stuff. All right, so I'm going to pull up there's your December 25th to 29th. Do I have the dates right? Yeah, 2019. So this was the one that was absolutely way off the charts. It was like 25 HDDs warmer than the warmest forecast. And we could look at it in terms of rankings for this week. And in fact, it was for that period, December 25th to December 29th, it was in fact the warmest in this record period. So this record goes back, I guess, 70 years is what it tells you here. And it was the 70th or the warmest. So if you're wondering, hey, how did that rank historically? Yeah, it ranked pretty darn warm. And I think I can shift 5 days ahead. Actually, but we need to shift 7 days ahead. So let me do this real quick and we'll just look at the current, most recent. So January 5th, 2020. So this is the period that also was pretty darn warm. You can see all the reds. These are anomalies, and these little numbers hard to read probably, but also very, very warm for basically the entire country. And again, the ranking here was pretty warm. So not record warmest, but it looks like it was 66 out of 71. So top 5 or top 10 event. And I'll just also show one other thing here. Let's just show the hemispheric pattern, just so we can take a look at that. And maybe that'll be a good spot for other folks to kind of jump in and talk about the pattern and things like that. Yeah, so let me just open it up. Now I've been talking for a while. What do you guys see in terms of this period of really significant warmth, and importantly, warmth that obviously was not fully captured by the models, and that's being generous. Obviously, we had what was the CFS here for the most recent verification was at 175. The EC was at 158, and it verified 114. So it's being generous to say that the models did not capture well this pattern. But yeah, let me open it up. Do you guys have any thoughts or questions about this recent period?
So one thing I've noticed in these last two verifications, it seems like the MJO analog had at least was on the idea of it being warm, full amplitude. So I'm curious if, does that hemispheric map look like some, MJO composites for whatever phase the MJO was in back in mid-December?
But I think that's a great point, Professor Decker. I noticed that too, and we can look at that. But I happened to look at this earlier, so I'll pull this up. Let's see, was it the past 30 days? I think it was the past 30 days. If you look at performance over the past few weeks, the MJO analog is amongst the best here. So I think that's right. In terms of, no, I'm sorry. Your question though did the pattern match the analog pattern?
Right. I matched in terms of it being warmth, but that hemispheric pattern, for instance, the areas of anomalous ridges and troughs, is that lining up nicely with an MJO forced look, or is it something else in it? We just got sort of lucky that the MJO suggested warmth, but it's actually some other driver.
That's a great point, and I'm going to open it up here too for maybe Nat if you want to jump in. But let's give a little background too on this. So we know we know just from the verifications, looking at the recent predictions, that the MJO analog did, as our forecast data points go, was one of the best, right? So we know that. Here's a look at where the MJO has been over the past few weeks, and of course the forecast too. But you can look back and see where it's been. The December points here are, I think, in red, so you can follow it as it went from, phase 3 was around December 15th, and then it stretched briefly into phase 6, 7 near the end of the month, and then did a hard hook back toward phase 4 in in the last couple of days, and then the forecast is in green. I also have, do I have this up? I don't know if I have it up. Hold on one second. I'm just going to pause my thing here. I think I have. I think I may have is it here? Yeah, here it is. Let me unpause here for a second. This is the, if you can see my screen, this is sort of a byproduct of some of the work that Professor Decker did, where I kind of generated this phase diagram. It's not labeled well here, and I won't search for it for the moment. But basically, this is for around this time of year. It's looking at the anomaly, HDD anomalies for the 16 to 20 day period associated with the RMN. So in other words, yep. If the RMN was initialized or was in phase kind of 3, 16 to 20 days later, historically, that's a pretty warm signal. And really from phase 3 to 5, it's relatively warm. And then, it's at its coldest peak, at least empirically, based on this data set, right around phase 7 and 8. So I think this is interesting too, in the sense that, of course, it is, we've seen some of the best signal out here. It did briefly get to 6, 7, but perhaps that's part of the problem too, that it was only a brief incursion into 6 and 7. All right, I'm going to go back.
In mid-December, when the last forecast was in mid-December, so that was in those warm phase 2, phase 3 regions, if I remember the.
Yeah, let's look at that again. Right. So, so you could see, it was right around. It was kind of a weak signal, but it was out here. Yeah. And that forecast specifically was, what did we say? 20. What was it? The 10th. Yeah, the 10th is the one that really absolutely came in gangbusters warm, and the 10th. The 17th. Yeah, it was out phase 2 and 3, which in the 16 to 20 day forecast, do suggest warmth. And that's that's certainly, let's go back. Actually, do I have that there just real quick? What was the MJO? Yeah, so the MJO was 143, and that compares to the 30-year normal. It was about 8 HDDs below the 30-year normal. And then for the following week, it was about 10, right? About 10 yep. HDDs, which, obviously we've only been looking at the MJO analog input for a little while now, but from what I've seen, that's actually a pretty good departure from normal. When it shows something like 5 or 10, that's a lot of times it's 1 or 2. So that was actually a pretty good signal, subjectively speaking. But I don't know, Nat, to really Professor Decker's question here, I should say too, I have been toying around with trying to produce an NSEP reanalysis map from those analogs, Professor Decker, but it's not quite there yet. So that could more readily answer your question.
Yeah.
But yeah, Nat or anyone want to jump in terms of thinking that, was this, is this pattern kind of consistent with what you might expect from MJO, or are we just fishing here in terms of trying to understand why this pattern ended up so much warmer than expected.
Yeah, I'd have to look at this a little bit more closely. Because I mean, it seems like the MJO amplitude just hasn't been that strong until, of course, now in the forecast we see a big jump to 4 or 5. But as your numbers showed, I mean, it's still strong enough to give a departure of around 10. So, yeah, it's possible. I have to look a little bit more carefully at the pattern.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing from Nat, it's not crystal clear, certainly, that this was, that maybe the models were, the numerical guidance just missed the MJO signal. It's possible that it's something to do with the MJO signal, but it's also very possible that there's other significant contributors. But just to back to one of the things Nat said, yeah, it does look like, I mean, clearly there's a stronger signal here with a higher amplitude phase 3, but it does, it does look like it was just near the edge of, picking up on some of those, amplitudes where there is at least a moderate type signal or weak to moderate signal. Anyone else have any, before we get off the attribution train here, does anyone else have any thoughts here? I mean, I don't want to call it a model. I don't know if it's fair to call this a complete model failure. I guess we'd call it something else. But, does anyone else have any thoughts here in terms of why the EC and the CFS in particular were so far, did not resolve well the forecast here from the past couple of weeks?
Maybe they just didn't anticipate the strength of that trough near Alaska. That's the only thing I can really guess. I mean, it's a pretty strongly negative anomaly over Alaska.
Yeah. I guess one other thing we could, that reminds me, Michael, one thing we could do is we can look back here at the forecast. We don't have all the models, but we can get some of the data from our friends here at Maxar, December 10th, right? So we'll change that. Let's just see what their report showed. This is the epic failure, right? This is the one where things verified, what was it again? 102. The forecast was about, the forecasts were much warmer. All right, so let's look at that again. All right, so, it's funny. I mean, looking at the map certainly doesn't look super cold or anything. I mean, there's definitely some warmth in the southeast. Let's compare it actually to what verified. Where was that again? I'm just going to, so we kind of look at it, what we say, the 25th, 29th. And we'll go back to temperatures since it's probably easier to do it that way. Oh, that's minimum temperature. Let's go to, I guess, average temperature. So that looks. There we go. Yeah, so there's the map, right? That's verification. So for example, Chicago, like 19 HDs below normal. Yeah, you could definitely see there was a big failure around the Midwest. The Midwest here, Chicago was kind of near normal. It's funny here too, like the EC weeklies, from a pattern perspective, doesn't look terrible, does it?
No.
Yeah. The Maxar, obviously in the Midwest, that pattern did not work out so well. let's just take a quick look at what they were saying during this period. Let's see if I don't know, see if any interesting tidbits. Forecast carries similar themes. Above normal temperatures in the south, colder up in the north. Spatial spread similar to the next 15 days. Variability along the north. Likely influenced by a low frequency standing wave around phases 1 and 2. The angular momentum is expected to remain within, I guess, normal. Although this is a lower confidence, overall, the forecast is slightly warmer than the 10-year and more significantly warmer than the 30-year per national GWD measures. Yeah, so Maxar's forecast 143, right? Yeah, so they were a little bit warmer than the 30-year. Let's see what the forecast risk showed. Confidence is low on poor model performance at this lead time in recent weeks. All right, well, that was a good heads up. Risk lean warmer in general. Okay, well, I mean, they did have some interesting tidbits here, I guess, if you're, they talked about low confidence and they talked about a warm lean. So maybe there were some, you could argue, some hints here. Okay. Anything else before we switch gears to the current forecast?
I don't have all these oscillations in my head yet. So like when you mentioned the positive EPO and positive WPO, are those associated with a giant trough in Alaska?
Yeah, positive, where do they say? Oh, yeah, positive EPO, if I've got this right, that's typically big trough, or trough anyway, anomalous trough, Alaska, Gulf of Alaska, and vice versa. Negative EPO, big ridge over Alaska. The WPO is similar, but it's shifted a little bit further west. So think like Alaska, the Bering Straits toward eastern Russia. That's kind of the WP signal. And if I remember correctly, all things being equal, the EPO, if you just look at a straight sort of correlation with, say, Midwest, Northeast temperatures, the EPO is a little bit stronger. The WP, is there's still a signal there, but it's a little bit weaker.
Okay.
I just have a question. Is there a resource where you translate these teleconnection indices directly to HDDs?
That's a good question. I don't think so. It would be interesting. So if I understand you correctly, where you could say empirically, like, hey, if there's negative NAOs in January, how does that correspond on average to HDDs, national HDDs?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. I don't think, well, now hold on here. Now maybe, let's see if we can pull up something here. They may have it. So I'm gonna click in AO, heating degree day. Let's see what happens here. Yeah, this might be kind of what you're talking about, Nat. I have to dig into this a little bit, but it looks like they find analogs. Is this just analogs to the current AO, or can you specify? Yeah, I have to play around with this a little bit. I think this is just an analog to the current state. So, all right, so take a step back. The AO, I think this green line is, the observed AO. So it's shifted quite a bit positive over the past few days. So I think they do some sort of analog approach, although it looks a little bit odd, and then run that forward. I think what would be really cool, though, and I think this is also what you were at. I mean, I think this is cool too, but if you could specify thresholds, right? So if you can just say, I want to look at AOs, regardless of where it is today. If you just think that, say, mid-January, the AO is going to be moderately positive, can you just do a filter on that, and so that you can better assess what the relationship is between AO and HDDs for that time of year? Yeah. I don't know if you can do that here, but it looks like you can get part of the way down. All right. I guess let's shift gears to the forecast. I don't know about you guys, but I always, I'm trying to think of a good analog to this or analogy, but forecasting is frustrating, right? I feel, I don't know, I'll be honest, like I feel somewhat unfulfilled about like addressing this forecast. Like, how did it verify 103 HDDs? Like, I guess it's the beauty of our field too, though, and the fact that we don't have answers to all these questions. And, so some of us have jobs, right? And it gives us jobs and opportunities. But it still feels unfulfilling that, there's not a more explicit answer to why it verified. All right, that's my rant for the day.
I guess we could take some solace. There's the rule of thumb in forecasting: never forecast a record, and this was certainly a record. So
yeah,
feel too bad about the fact that no one forecasted 102.8.
Yeah. And in fairness too, I wish Paul Roundy were on the line too, because he was out there, and Professor Decker, you weren't far behind with some of these forecasts here on the very low end. So maybe in a future week we could dig into some of his. I know he's got some interesting tools and stuff. Maybe it's something that we should spend a little bit more time on.
And I think the other thing is, anytime you have a probabilistic forecast, it's tough to make an evaluation on a single forecast, because if you're right every time, then your spread should be 0, right? Basically. So the bottom line, so in a reliability sense, you should be higher and lower some of the time. So I guess the more systematic assessment is, maybe at the end of a season, how reliable were you? Were you overconfident? Were you underconfident when you factor in the spread?
That's right. Yeah. Good point. Okay. All right. So now we're looking at today's forecast board. I think it's updated. So why don't we turn it over to who wants to volunteer and go first? And again, let's try, especially for the student forecasters, and let's try to go through it as if you're kind of giving a briefing to a client. But who would like to get us going? And if you'd like to share the screen, just let me know.
I guess I could go first.
Sure.
Okay, let's see if I remember how to do this. All right. So, hello everyone. My forecast was for 143.2 HDDs, which is, I guess that's pretty, a little bit warmer than the 10 and 30-year normal. They seem to be the same this week. Excuse me. Normal confidence spread of 24.8 HDDs. My current thinking, looking at my usual teleconnections and the CPC, is most things point to a warm eastern half of the country and a colder western half of the country, with both the AO and NAO remaining pretty strongly positive, anomalously for this time of year. And the P&A looks to remain, or at least to head negative, and then probably remain negative. The only thing I can see as a risk for this forecast is I guess a wild card EPO is supposed to go negative, but not very strongly negative. So if that ends up being significantly stronger towards the negative side, that could force some of the cold further into higher demand areas like Chicago, and if it's really, really negative, which I doubt, maybe even towards New York. But other than that, I don't see too many risks. It seems to be a well-telegraphed pattern, in my opinion. So are there any questions?
Did you say, Michael, thanks for the briefing. Did you say, are you implying this is a high confidence forecast?
To me personally, yes, I would. It looks like a high confidence forecast to me. That's not to say that I'm guaranteeing that it'll be in that in within the spread. That'd be arrogant of me to say that, but um, it's higher confidence than the past two verified forecasts, obviously.
Yeah. So how come your spread doesn't reflect that? I'm looking at your spread, Michael, and it looks to be exactly normal. Wouldn't that be
um,
average confidence?
I don't like to change the spread too much to account for things that I might not have seen, or maybe I missed something. For instance, industry one might have seen something that I didn't that indicates the pattern could be significantly colder from an HDD perspective. So I don't like to change up the spread too much to account for things I might have missed.
Okay. And remember, I'm just playing character here, so I'm being a little bit of a hard, you know what. Um, so Michael, I don't understand that. So it seems like you're trying to have it both ways. On one hand, you told me that you think your confidence is above normal, but when I ask you for a number, and these numbers, I'm going to put into my models. And if you have high confidence, it's not about arrogance or anything like that. It's about the facts. And if you think this is a high confidence forecast, I want to know that, because then I could get a more accurate read on this, and my model is going to, it may affect my trading decisions or whatever. But if you really think it's more of a normal confidence, that's okay too. I just don't understand why you're telling me high confidence, but your numbers suggest moderate confidence.
Well, that's why I like to explain the forecast in person, just so that you have an understanding of my position here. That I'm not comfortable changing the spread. So I think a good range is between 168 and 100 and what is that? 21 point
Well, Michael,
121.
but again, sorry to interrupt, Michael, but I got to run here in a minute. I understand your range. I got it at 24.8. I can do the math from there. I would just want to understand from you. Should I use that 24.8 as the baseline that I put in my model, or should I do something like maybe a 20 or 15, because you know your forecast is high confidence? What should I put in my model today?
You should use the 24.8 simply because I like this. I'm high confidence that it'll be within the spread. I should say rather. So I'm confident it'll be within that spread, but I rather than high confidence and high confidence in the pattern. But I'm very confident that it'll be within that spread. Is what I'm going to communicate to you. So I think you'd be well off to stay within the spread.
Okay. And uh, and again, out of character here for a second. I just might. It's not so much. I don't think you need to say a high confidence. That spread is meant to represent about 70% of the distribution, like a one standard deviation spread. So that's the way to frame it. It's always, that number should always be what you think is about that 70% risk. So it's not like, hey, I have super high confidence it's going to be within 24.8. If you told me like I have 99% confidence it's going to be within 24.8, then 24.8 should not be your number, because that would not represent a one sigma. Your number should be, I don't know, 15 or 20. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, those are the questions I had. Anyone else have questions for Michael? All right, thanks, Mike.
I'll add a question. So I see you've got 10% 30-year normal, but the recent verification seems like the 10-year normal is doing better. So I'm curious why you like the 30-year normal.
I usually use the 10-year normal. I used it up until what was it? October or November. I can't remember which month it was. But in the winter, I understand the 30-year normal is usually better than the 10-year. So I switched over because of that.
Okay.
All right. Who'd like to go next?
I could go next. So
Great.
I'm here representing the CPC informally, since that's my the approach I always use. So looking at the, and maybe you can bring up the CPC map if you have that available. So the current temperature forecast pretty much splits the country 50-50 between above normal and below normal, but more populated areas are in those above normal areas. So I am weighting my forecast a little bit towards the low side in terms of the HDDs. However, I noted that the gradient is such that if it's a little warmer than what this forecast indicates, maybe the warmth is pushing into Kansas or Ontario. Well, if it pushes into Ontario, that doesn't affect the HDDs that we're forecasting. On the other hand, if the cold air, sort of alluding to, maybe this is similar to what Michael was mentioning, maybe that cold air up in Canada that's implied by this forecast, if we're just a little further south, that would have a significant increase in the HDDs. So I didn't really go too much below the 30-year normals for my HDD forecast based on this map. And then I also bumped up my sigma sum to reflect that sort of uncertainty or account for the fact that maybe we could have significantly below normal temperatures or above normal HDDs start to move into that Great Lakes region with a small shift in the gradient.
And just to give, there's Professor Decker's number. Just to give a quick plug to Professor Decker, I think he continues to be one of the best performers here. Yeah, there's the heating season. And in terms of human forecasters, right at the top. And we have this stat we don't talk about too often, but I was looking at this the other day. I know the screen, this table is hard to read. I apologize. I have to improve it in the future. But if you look in terms of directional hit rate, that just means are you on the right side of normal? And Professor Decker has the highest directional hit rate of anyone who's forecasted more than a handful of times. Nat Johnson's there, but that's still early on. So, but 75% of the time, Professor Decker has been on the right side of climatology there. So that's pretty good. Anyway, any questions for Professor Decker? All right. Who'd like to go next?
I can go next.
Sounds like Philip.
Yes. All right. So my forecast this time was about the same that I usually do with my 10-year mean, my 30-year moving average, MJO signal, CPC forecast, and teleconnections, and just a little bit of the dynamical models. So I noted that tropical convection is strong over Central Africa and Indonesia, and I noticed that the convection over Indonesia and Africa seems to have been very persistent in the past few months. So looking at the MJO signal in phase 4, if you combine that with the lag composites and also with our MJO analog, that leads to a generally warm signal. And the ENSO is also a slightly warm signal in the Pacific. So overall, I went with 147.1 as my tropical value. And the CPC forecast, which was already discussed, is also warm. And there's also that gradient that is in the northern area, which I said was a reason for uncertainty. And reading the CPC forecast, it seems that they assume there's a possibility of some pattern change by late winter, which based on the wording seems like it doesn't affect this time of the forecast, but could be a player into the next few weeks. And then looking at our teleconnections, as mentioned, we have our positive AO, NAO, and our negative PNA. Now, I didn't factor the EPO into my forecast, but while we were discussing it, I took a quick look, and sure enough, I saw that the models were starting to show the EPO shifting from positive closer to more of a negative value, which could be a potential concern. Although, as I said, that was not in my forecast, but that may be something that I may try to add in the future. So if you pull up the EPO really quickly, let's see, yes, EPO forecast, it looks like it's heading into negative territory by the start of the period. And then after that, I also looked at the dynamical guidance, which we saw that the EC has this ridge. Interestingly, the EC shows a ridge west trough east configuration, which isn't exactly what I was expecting based on what I read from the CPC. And it shows that the cool anomalies are still staying in the west. Well, the CFS, as usual, is much colder than everything else, but the CFS looks like it's sort of doing this weird positive, very positively tilted trough that's sort of with an axis that's tilted from about California into Ontario, which to me seemed a little suspect, but I guess it's the CFS. And then interestingly though, if we compare both this EC and the CFS, both are actually showing generally cooler. I guess this EC also sort of has a small lower heights over California too, but the ridge trough configuration looks more like a classic ridge west trough east as opposed to what the CFS has. And both are actually showing higher HCD, so both are forecasting slightly colder than normal conditions, which I think is on the, yeah. So you can see that the 162 and the 163 are both below, are both higher than the normal. So putting everything together, I got a value of 150.3, and looking at some of the mixed signals and hearing a bit about a possible pattern shift, I decided to go with a lower confidence in case some of the things started evolving a little faster and things. So I would say that that there's a risk that everything verifies a little colder.
Interesting. Yeah. A couple of folks have brought up the temperature gradient. I had a chart here. Let me see if I still have it. Yeah. Now this is just this is observation over the next or past 7 days, and then if we look at the see if I have it up here. I think it's this one. Yeah. I think if we look at the next 10 days, I think there is a lot of cold expected to be located near the border. Yeah, there we go. So that's the 72-hour EC. So yeah, this just a couple of folks have mentioned the gradient, and I seem to recall back in October or November, we had a couple forecasts where we did have a lot of cold bottled up in Canada, and it kind of, you know, just a slight change in the pattern can cause a big shift in the HDDs. So I think that's an interesting point that a couple of folks brought up. Right, any questions for Philip?
Yeah, I was just wondering what the process is for getting getting the HDD values for each of the components that you have.
It is sort of subjective since I don't really have an exact way to translate the map into the HDD numbers. So I sort of look at what I look at what Maxar's report is and how they got their numbers, and then I sort of use the coloring and the anomalies on their map as a bit of a reference into how I want to change my, how I want to get to the numbers for each of the individual things. And then I use the percentage weights to get my final value.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it's definitely it's not just go back to that research exercise. You know, it's one of those things. It's especially now that we have the MJO analog, it wouldn't be that hard to plug in other tel connections and have something very similar to the MJO analog, but for EPO and NAOAO. So let's keep that in the back of our minds, because if we can find, you know, a student or someone who's got a little bit of extra time, I think we could definitely you know, make something like that or make a tool for that. All right.
Just wondering,
Yep.
Is there a place where we can access what the MJO analog is?
Well, you can access it from this page. It should be on here, right? Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, like, to see where it is in relation to. So is that just based completely on where the phase diagram is at the current time?
Right, right. So it pulls data. Whoops. It's an analog as a function of the the RMM,
Mm-hmm.
and the RMM's lag. This is something that Professor Decker really helped to design. So he can talk more about it, but it basically pulls up the latest value, and
Mm-hmm.
the latest value you can see is always lagged by 2 days. So it takes that into account. So it's actually almost like an 18 to 20 day forecast, or 22 or whatever. But
Okay.
this is what it does. It looks at historical relationships based on the lag relationship of the RMM 1 and 2, and HDDs. So, and that forecast that's in there is doing the same thing. It's just pulling the latest data. So it's saying, okay, here are the RMMs, 0.6 minus 0.6 for today, and then going through and finding analogs. And the analogs is, there's some subjectivity in terms of determining the radius of scope, but basically, we came up with, I guess, some sort of reasonable thing that it looks at, a half standard deviation or something within of values within proximity of those RMMs, and it then calculates the HDD mean and standard deviation as a function of those analog events.
And then that goes into that graph that you showed early on in the call, right?
Yes. So then this graph we added a little bit later on. This is not exactly that, the number and stuff is derived a little bit differently. But what we did is we developed these charts. And by the way, all this stuff I can share. I'm happy to share all this stuff. So we're not trying to hide it or anything. It's just kind of in research mode. But the idea is we develop charts like this that show HDD anomalies and a few other things. Actually, we have think about it, I did start testing this for NAO and EPO, so that might be of interest to Nat. But we have something like this, and we could run it for any time of year. So the idea is maybe eventually we can have a calendar of these that we can post online, where you can also reference this along with the actual numbers to help inform your forecast.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one last thing is, so this map is generalized for the entire year, right? It's not, say, this map is only true for, say, this month or this day.
No, this map, I don't know if I have it open. Here. Okay.
Okay.
This is better. This is the code I was working on to do this. And no, so this one is January 15th. It's centered on January 15th. I think I used, I don't know, like a plus minus 20-day window around it. So you can, again, so the way the code's set up, you can have you can put in whatever date you want, January 15th, January 10th. You can create a window, whatever you want around that. And again, there's some subjectivity. Do you want to have it plus or minus 30 days, 10 days, 5 days? There's pros and cons. And then also, there's functional. There's some toggles or options in terms of the radius. In other words, this point here, how many analogs, or what's the radius where it's going to pull analogs? Is it going to be a small circle around it, or is it going to be a wide circle? And again, I don't think there's any fixed rule for what's right. It's just trying to find something that I think it appears reasonable and defensible and seems to have enough analog dates associated with it.
Mm-hmm. And the mark date is the date of the MJO, not the forecast date.
That's right. Exactly. The mark date is similar to a init date, and then there's a lag from that. Mm-hmm. So all it says is I'm going to find dates that basically are close to January 15th. Then it runs the lag relationship. So it's always going to be skewed a little bit to the right, or a little bit more toward, I guess, February as opposed to December in terms of the target dates.
Okay.
And it's meant to match reality, right? So, if you have any ideas or feedback to make it better, one of the things that I wanted to get to, and I just haven't, at least as of now, I thought it'd be interesting to look at this also in terms of different base states, and things like that, like ENSO and such. But yeah, so that, if you want to talk about it offline, we can. I want to make sure. I think we still have one or two forecasters. Zach, would you like to give us your 2-minute spiel?
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
All right. Hi, everybody. My forecast for the period of January 22nd to the 26th was 154.2 HDDs about, with a spread of 25 HDDs. This comes in, as you can see, of the human forecasters, one of only two, I think, that are colder than 30-year, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So my forecast was weighted, you can see 40% the 30-year, 20% the 10, 20% the trend, and then I factor in both the EC and the CFS. As Dr. Decker kind of pointed out earlier, I did notice in the last 30 days especially that the 10-year normal has actually been doing pretty well. Normally I would just factor in the 30-year based on just hearing what you guys have talked about over the last year about what works well in the winter, but I had decided to add in the 10-year as a factor as well. Basically, I feel that it's going to look something like a trough ridge pattern as you move west to east. I can say certainly that there's I find some risk in this forecast as I was looking at the EC and the CFS progressions from starting right now, moving into that period of the 22nd to the 26th, that it seemed like whatever pattern, the very strong positive NEO, negative PNA pattern was weakening. And I think Philip kind of alluded to that earlier, that there's a possibility that what we're seeing right now is going to weaken and we could possibly transition into something else. So that's my thinking on that. And then, the model performance has been relatively poor throughout this whole winter. So just by the fact that I weighed about 20% on those two models, which are the two coldest forecasts, probably pulls my number just higher than the 30-year, whereas if I didn't factor those two in at all, I'd probably be a slightly warmer forecast. So there's certainly some risk there. And I think just overall, based on what we've seen, that with how the pattern has been progressing over the last couple of weeks, that there is a chance that this forecast could be relatively warm as well. So there's that to keep in mind. Does anybody have any other questions?
Just something you said at the end, Zach. Do you see a skew to this forecast? If we see another big bust by 25 HDDs or 20 HDDs, do you have any sense as to whether it's likely to be colder or warmer?
Based on what I've seen, I think this forecast has a bit more of a warm risk than a cold risk. So I think it does skew a little bit more towards the warm side. I think the chances of seeing a forecast below 129, there's a bit more of a chance that you could see that rather than a colder forecast.
Okay. But I guess it's also, and my client hat on, looking at your numbers, Zach, it's clear to me, we've been looking at these forecasts and verifications from the past few weeks, and they seem to keep coming in warmer. And, there's a feeling around the market, or I don't know, maybe some people are saying this, that it's going to be warm forever. I'm looking at your numbers, Zach, and you're telling me that's not the case. Maybe there's a slight skew to, if this busts warm, but, your number is at or slightly above the 30-year. So whatever mechanisms, whatever reasons we were in this warm pattern, you don't think it's a long-term warm signal. Is that correct, Zach?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Well, we have like 1 minute left. Any final questions for Zach? Okay. I think that was pretty clear and concise. Any final thoughts in our last minute here in terms of today's discussion?
Something I'll just add in, I don't know if it was said or not, I don't think it was, but the CFS and the EC are within 0.3 HDDs of each other, so that's kind of, you don't usually see that, so it's kind of interesting to me. Just tossing that out there. Maybe we're all missing something if they're that close together.
That would be an interesting topic of research. Would be, you know, when these two inputs are close for some definition of close, are they more accurate than if they were completely, you know, one was 10 above normal and one was 10 below normal? Does that actually imply, we sort of intuitively think that means there's more uncertainty in the forecast, but is there actually a relationship in how close those two models are and how accurate they are? That'd be interesting to see.
I think that's a great point. All right. I think we'll have to leave it there, though, looking at the time. Thank you, everyone. I think this is a really good discussion, kind of getting us back into the swing of things. And we'll hopefully do it again next week. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.